You're celebrated for who you are, and if you have been treated differently on the basis of that, there's help and support for you.
Welcome to Talking Shop, the Communities Inc. podcast. Episode 13. Why do people hate?
Okay, hi, my name's Shamsha. I'm joined by Emily today from the Centre for Hate Studies at the University of Leicester. Hello Emily, how are you doing?
Good, thank you. Thank you for having me on the podcast.
Great, no, you're welcome. So tell us a little bit about the Centre for Hate Studies. How did it come about? How long has it been going?
Absolutely, love that question. So the Centre for Hate Studies, we started back in 2014. So very exciting that we're celebrating our 10-year anniversary soon. The centre began, it was very much born out of a research project we did based in Leicester, the Leicester Hate Crime Project. We did a piece of research that was focusing on the experiences of various different minoritised people. We engaged with over 4,000 people across the city to speak about their experiences of being treated differently on the basis of who they are or who they're perceived to be. From those findings, which were absolutely staggering and showed a really damning picture, that's very much where the centre was born. We realised that hate crime wasn't an issue that could be ignored. So for the last decade, the centre's been focusing on improving understanding of, awareness of and responses to hate crime. We do that through a range of different research projects with a range of different focuses. Really exciting in particular is we use a range of different research methodologies that focus on really amplifying the voices of people that we don't typically hear from, and using those voices then to inform policy changes or training programmes to make sure that we're representing those victims and communities' priorities in how to address hate crime moving forward.
Right. Well, you certainly have influenced the work that we did, that Communities Inc. did. We started doing work around hate crime in 2013. And the resources, some of the resources that were produced as part of that piece of work, you know, we use and we still use now. So Thank you so much for that. It's been really valuable for us, and I'm sure for many other people. So, I mean, you know, we hear about hate crime, we hear about hate incidents. What is a hate crime? What's your definition?
Yeah, I think it's a really great question. And I think that can be a really scary question for some people to ask, particularly in this climate. I would say there's no simple answer depending on who you ask and when you ask that question and where you're asking that question. The answer would be a little bit different. But the most simple way that I can answer that question is a hate crime as such is an act of violence, and I use that term really, really broadly, but an act of violence targeted towards somebody because of their difference or their perceived difference. What I mean by that is it tends to be an identity that that person has, or like I say, is perceived to have. In this country, that tends to be monitored characteristics or monitored strands of hate crime. So the identities of race, religion, disability, sexual orientation and transgender status. These are the identities that we typically understand that hate crimes can be subjected to. However, at the centre, we deliberately use this really broad definition of difference because we understand that really any identity can be targeted and treated differently deliberately because of that identity or what that difference is or what that perceived vulnerability is.
Yeah, and anybody could be affected by hate crime, can't they?
Absolutely.
Because of that perception. If somebody, you know, we always sort of say if you're a straight man going to a gay club with some of your colleagues after work one day, on leaving the club, if there's a perpetrator out there, they're not going to ask you what your sexual orientation is. They're going to make an assumption. So in that sense, anybody could be affected.
Absolutely. And I think in so many ways that can make some barriers for allies, for communities, which definitely shows how deep-rooted prejudices are in society, that I think we all understand how easily we could be subjected to being treated differently on the basis of somebody making a snap decision and assuming we're part of a community, which is really quite scary times when you think that we want to be united rather than pushed apart.
Yeah. And so have you, I mean, you've been going 10 years now.
Yeah.
Have you noticed a pattern? Has there been changes in the nature of hate crimes or, you know, who they're happening to or how they're happening? What sort of patterns have you noticed over the last 10 years?
Yeah, it's a really tricky question because I think at the centre and broadly throughout the sector, it's really tricky work, so you want to focus on the positives, but unfortunately it's getting more and more difficult to find those positives. I'd say reflecting upon the last decade, we're definitely seeing a really, really scary spiral in relation to hate crime, in relation to prejudice, not just hate crimes, but also hate incidents that we're seeing. And by that, that's acts that I'm referring to that might not meet a criminal threshold as such, but acts that are treating somebody differently on the basis of who they are. This seems to be happening more and more and more. So I mentioned that the centre was very much born out of the Leicester Hate Crime Project, which was that a decade ago. What we have seen in terms of official statistics over the last decade is a monumental leap in recorded hate crimes. I'd caveat that by saying that we do understand that with most crimes, the recorded rates tend to be an underrepresentation of what's going on. And our recent research with different partners throughout the country demonstrate quite how low reporting rates are. So given that we are seeing over 100,000 more hate crimes reported now than a decade ago, in a recent piece of research we did with an organisation, Protection Approaches, this was looking at the experiences of East and Southeast Asian communities, and we found that there was only about a 10% reporting rate there. So you think this is a community particularly affected after COVID as a trigger event, and if only 10% of that community is reporting and levels officially are what they are, that's really, really scary. So yeah, I would say that it's a really scary time in terms of where we are in relation to hate crime, and it's really scary to think where we're going as well.
Yeah, I mean, in the last 10 years we've had the EU referendum, we've had COVID. More recently, in the last year or two, we've got all the whole issue around the boats.
Absolutely.
And there's a lot going on, isn't there?
There is, and I think you've mentioned a few really good examples of some trigger events that we see. And again, this goes back to why at the centre we deliberately use a really broad definition of hate crime. And it's really important to be thinking about hate incidents and microaggressions as well, because it isn't just those identities that we typically talk about that have been targeted in amongst trigger events. It's all these different identities that can have a finger pointed at them to blame them for one thing or another. Just those divisions just seem to be just everywhere at the moment.
Why are hate incidents important to you? Why do you think?
Yeah, I think the important thing to remember with hate crime is that these incidents don't happen in a vacuum. For people that are subjected to hate crimes, the foundation of that is hate incidents. So I probably should mention in relation to what a hate crime is, in many ways that doesn't actually exist as a thing in law. For something to be a hate crime, that act had to already be a crime in and of itself. For it to then be a hate crime on top of that, we have to be able to see, or it has to be perceived that incident happened to that person on the basis of a particular monitored characteristic. That's when it then becomes flagged as a hate crime. As I've already mentioned, that so many incidents that happen, these are incidents that are clearly being targeted against a person, but they haven't met that criminal threshold. So that doesn't mean that the perpetrator's being hauled into court because of that. It's just these incidents that are happening that are deliberately targeting somebody. It's deliberate nastiness or division or something that's said to a person or inflicted upon a person to make sure that they know that they're not wanted in a particular way or to cause harm. Something we really focus on at the Centre for Hate Studies is looking at those harms of hate. And we think that's the important thing that we should be paying attention to. It's the fact that these incidents, they cause real harm to people. We know that they're happening on a daily basis. It isn't a one-off incident that's happening one time in somebody's life. It could be happening throughout their day, all day, every day. And the impacts of that we're seeing in our research and other research from across the country, from across the world really, is that people are very much then changing who they are as a result of these incidents, of being treated differently. Even if it isn't perpetrated directly against them, it's media outlets or politicians really reinforcing this message that somebody isn't wanted on the basis of who they are or for lots of different identities they might have. And people internalise that. We're seeing our research is showing that they'll change the way that they dress. They'll talk about themselves differently. They'll hide parts of their identity. Really worryingly, we're seeing people not going out anymore, trying to stay at home, leaving their jobs. Very recently at the centre we did a piece of research looking at hate in higher education. And we saw a huge amount of students talking about actually trying to either leave their degree programme or leave the institution completely because they just don't feel safe or wanted. And you think that just changes a person's entire life. And when we think about wanting safe and inclusive communities, this just isn't providing a platform for that to happen.
Yeah. And, you know, sometimes those hate incidents can be just as harmful as hate crimes.
Absolutely.
You know, they know they don't have less of an impact just because they're not identified as a criminal offence.
Absolutely, and I think when you think about that messaging to victims and to those with lived experience, to know that this is something that isn't actually seen as completely unacceptable in the eyes of the law, how is it that you would feel really safe and really affirmed in who you are? We see a lot of hate incidents happening, particularly in the modern age on, say, social media platforms or online, and particularly social media platforms that have changed legislation to make it actually okay for hate incidents to occur. And I would say microaggressions, but we really are at a level of hate incidents being deemed acceptable in community guidelines. What does that do to victims or platform users? It very much reinforces that they're not wanted. And with the police kind of deprioritising counting hate incidents as well, because this is something that could be reported to the police just to be monitored, I think it does reinforce to communities that it's almost like incidents have to get really, really bad before you can come forward. And there's so many case studies that we see from decades ago all the way to modern day with hate crime victims having to reach a point of being murdered or taking their own lives before we listen. And again, that's because we've silenced the conversation of hate incidents there.
And also, I guess, that because there's a normalisation, isn't there? I mean, Ofsted reviews have found that, you know, young girls in a school environment think that sexual harassment is part of growing up.
Absolutely.
They think it's normal. In fact, they think it's so normal, they don't even bother reporting it.
Yeah.
Because when they report it, they just get brushed off. Oh, you're being silly. Oh, just ignore them. Just keep away from them.
Yeah.
And then we also have, you know, characters like Andrew Tate
Yeah.
that promote hostility. So it's not
Absolutely.
it's not even that these things are happening to people. It's been encouraged and stoked
Yeah.
by individuals and organisations. We have, you know, organisations promoting hostility towards
Absolutely.
people of different faiths, towards refugees, towards LGBT community.
Completely.
And yeah, you know, in our training, when we talk about it, it can be quite overwhelming, really.
It can, and in this age of misinformation and disinformation, I think that's what's really scary, kind of fake news being deliberately spread.
Yeah.
That's really, really scary to think that people don't know what's real and what isn't, and that really stokes the flames of pointing those fingers at each other and creating those divisions. And for people that might have grown up their whole lives being told that that difference is wrong or it's unacceptable, that isn't going to reinforce to that person that actually I can come forward and ask for help.
Yeah.
And you think, not even just in a criminal justice sense, but in a personal well-being sense, how will that person know that they can come forward and say that they might be experiencing mental ill health, for example, as a result of being treated in this way?
Yeah.
So it's absolutely instilling in people completely different understandings of what their normal is.
Yeah. And I think, you know, that's why the direction of our work changed in 2016 towards focusing on the bystander, because we thought we need to try and create sort of positive experiences.
Yeah.
You know, and I know myself, I live up the road in Oadby in Leicestershire, lived there 20 years, never had any problems. Within days of the result of the EU referendum, I was involved in 2 racist incidents. And there was the second one, this woman walked away shouting racial abuse at me. And I remember standing there thinking, what is going on? You know, it was a really strange time after the result.
Yeah.
And this guy just came over to me and said, are you all right? He said, what was all that? And he stood there, he chatted to me, made sure I was okay, asked me if I wanted a drink, asked me if I was all right getting home. And you know what? I felt so much better.
Absolutely.
I thought, okay, she wasn't very nice, but a complete stranger who'd been standing at the bus stop, who then came over, touched base with me, checked that I was okay, made all the difference in making me feel better, in thinking,
Absolutely.
do you know, there are good people out there as well. There are people that don't find this behaviour acceptable. And it just sort of rebalanced my sort of perception. Now, I'm not that fragile that I never would have gone out again.
Yeah.
You know, it's only a very small parade. But if that had happened to my parents, who were in their 80s, they might not have stepped outside the door again.
Absolutely, because that fear, that's not irrational. And exactly like you say, if someone's going to come over and remind you that actually you are wanted and you are celebrated, that goes a huge way for a person remembering actually these headlines I'm seeing in the media, the words that I'm hearing my politicians say, and now the words that I'm hearing being shouted at me in the street. There are still safe spaces for me, and I am still wanted, and I am still valued. That's huge. I know in my own research that focuses on how homeless people are treated on the basis of that perceived homeless identity, that people say that overwhelmingly what hurts them the most isn't the physical assault and it isn't the verbal assault, and there's a huge amount of data I have that says that these are really quite horrible incidents, but it's the way in which they're treated like they're invisible. And I've had participants talk to me about the fact that they've gone into shops before just to say, can you see me? Because they feel like they're invisible, like something's happened, and they don't even feel there anymore. And they say it's those moments of somebody smiling at them, or just saying hi, or have a nice day, or nice weather today, something really British like that, that makes all the difference in them still feeling connected to the community. And that isn't something that's hard to do. I think that's something that's really, really actionable for all of us. Yeah. It's cost neutral, which is great in this society, but just showing those acts of kindness and compassion to people, particularly someone that looks like they might need it, it goes a huge way.
Absolutely. I mean, we've been revising our microaggression training and have been doing lots of reading, and consistently the research says one of the main things that contributes to reducing prejudice is contact.
Absolutely.
Contact, exposure, connection.
Absolutely.
And really that's where we need to focus on, isn't it, in terms of creating those opportunities where people can have that. I just want to go back to, I mean, a lot of your work has been with victims of hate crime. What sort of support is available out there?
Yeah, luckily there are really, truly phenomenal organisations that work in this space. These are organisations that predominantly sit in the third sector, which do really, really wonderful work. What's incredible about these organisations is they're often really victim-led or lived experience-centric in their values. So those barriers that we see in relation to people going to the police, say, they don't exist quite as much in the third sector. So Stop Hate UK, for example, is a phenomenal organisation, the CEO of which recently featured on our podcast, reflecting on where we're at as a society. But they're a wonderful organisation that offers 24/7 support to anybody who has been targeted on the basis of their identity. So organisations like that exist where you don't have to have met a threshold or be a certain person or understand in a really neat and tidy way why what's happened to you is wrong. If it feels wrong and you've been targeted for a part of your personhood, there are places like that you can go. There are other organisations that then focus on particular monitor strands, which means you can have really informed conversations with people. So just some examples here, On Your Side is a platform that is set up specifically to help support East and Southeast Asian communities. So you can have conversations with people in various different languages that's really culturally informed, which is really important. And there's also organisations that exist such as the Sophie Lancaster Foundation, who focuses on alternative subcultures. And again, these organisations are so important for sending that messaging on one level, that it's okay who you are, you're celebrated for who you are, right the way through to, and if you have been treated differently on the basis of that, there's help and support for you. So there's a whole host of organisations that I would say absolutely still give us hope as a centre, that there's really good people out there doing some really good work.
Yeah. And what sort of support or messages are there from government in relation to sort of victims of hate crime?
I think that messaging is quite different today than what we were seeing a decade ago, and that's something that we're constantly having to adapt to and think about as a centre. At one point in time there was a hate crime strategy, but since that has expired, we haven't seen government backing from any of the political parties really to bring about a new hate crime strategy. Largely as a result of that, but I think as a result of a lot of things, not least because of the conversations around there being a woke agenda, or it being woke to care about hate crime or identities, we're seeing a consistent deprioritisation of hate crime. And I'd say that's something that feels very, very different to a decade ago. A decade ago we had hope that this is something that was growing in importance, whereas now We see, like I say, at a governmental level, what feels like rights being stripped away, and at very least that prioritisation and the platforming of hate crime. Beyond that, that filters down. So at a criminal justice level, we see that due to recent cases, the police now can use their discretion as to whether or not they want to record a hate incident. So we're going to see our recorded levels of hate crimes and hate incidents that might start to decrease in a way that might not reflect victims coming forward or victims' experiences. But what all the stats and the data are telling us is that this isn't an issue, which is really interesting when you look at our research and other people's research that shows this is absolutely an issue, and if anything, that is growing. So there seems to be a bit of a disparity there.
Yeah. Sounds a bit like the research that we had a few years ago that said racism didn't exist in this country anymore.
Yeah, it seems that certain statements can be made that you think, oh, actually the evidence base isn't quite telling us that.
Yeah. That's really disappointing, isn't it? Because I remember the last strategy that was in place was updated in 2016 as a result of the EU referendum when reported hate crimes did go up, and it reprioritised the nighttime economy, so it really focused people on where it was happening. And I think also it was around then that funding streams came in,
Absolutely.
work around the night. Some of that is still sort of hanging on now, but then it just, dropped off. I mean, you said before that it hadn't been revised, and I wasn't aware of that. I just thought it would have been, but it seems the last time the government had its finger on the pulse and was taking it seriously was, quite a while ago.
I think it is odd when you live in these spaces. It's quite a nice reminder, putting your head above ground and realising, oh, actually, I'm in an echo chamber of people that think this is important. And when you look at that governmental level, that's really, really quite scary when you're thinking, well, my evidence is telling me this has never been a bigger issue. And actually, we need to be thinking more dynamically than ever about how to address this, say, because of online incidents spiking, for example, or trigger events only happening more and more, of our world becoming so much more global, that trigger events that happen in one part of the world absolutely ricochet to having effects here. And then you look at what leaders are saying and you think that just doesn't match up with what we need right now.
So you mentioned podcast. You have your own podcast. Could you
We do.
tell us a little bit more about that, what it aims to achieve?
Absolutely. So our podcast is called Hidden Hate. And as its name suggests, the whole point of it is that we're giving a platform to the voices and the conversations that don't typically happen around hate crime. So many hate crimes are ignored anyway, but there's so many more specificities within that. And like I say, evolutions, I suppose, and ways in which society has become so much more dynamic, that we need to be more dynamic in understanding what's happening. So our podcast series covers a range of different topics that maybe aren't of, say, national importance, which we would argue they should be, but it gives listeners a bit of an insight into what is important, what is happening, how can I understand this, and what can I do about it. So we have 5 episodes out at the moment. I would highly recommend them. I am very biased, but I think they're a great listen. And we have a range of different guests from people with lived experience, from practitioners, those that have an insight into what's going on at a policy level, some really quite high profile figures. So it's a really interesting series. So episodes include hate in a digital world, hating disability, hating immigrants, hating women. And more recently, we've released a live episode, which was really interesting and really quite different, that was an in conversation with 2 CEOs of organisations I've actually already mentioned. So the CEOs of Stop Hate UK and the Sophie Lancaster Foundation, reflecting on where we are now. So yeah, the podcasts represent a whole range of different areas, which, we think is really interesting.
Yeah, that's great. We'll include a link to that in the description. So could you give us some examples of how some of the research the Centre's done has influenced, policy or practice at a local level?
Absolutely. So I mentioned the Leicester Hate Crime Project, which happened a decade ago, and I don't think any of us would be expecting, if you could have spoken to us a decade ago, that we would still be drawing upon that, or it would still be so relevant as it is today. But we've seen the research evidence from that and the over 4,000 victims that we worked with. We see that still shaping policy, training packages and so on today. So we saw that research be referenced in the Law Commission of Hate Crime and in a somewhat recent HMIC FRS report. These are kind of those spaces that's reflecting on where do we need to go in terms of hate crime. More recently, we saw, again, the Leicester Hate Crime Project was referenced in a bill that's going through in Poland at the moment, again, reflecting on where do we need to go. So largely, these kind of political movements, these bills, these policies, they're calling for a broadening in how we understand hate crime, understanding that things that aren't crimes are still important, understanding different identities and intersectional targeting is really important. So our research evidence has been used in those kind of spaces to change policy. And something that I think we find really important at the centre is that we don't lose sight of communities as well in terms of these conversations. So we're really keen that our work isn't just research evidence that goes off to be an academic journal article on a shelf that we're under no illusion that no one's reading as it's stuck behind a paywall. So we make sure that our data can be translated into really accessible forms of content that people can engage with, that can then go on to make an impact. So we've already mentioned the podcast. I'd say more recently something that we've been really excited to launch is our new Revisiting the Harms of Hate film. So that came from a research project that was reflecting on where are we 10 years on from the Leicester Hate Crime Project. So we spent a lot of time with lots of different marginalised communities in Leicester, and as a result produced our new film that represented their voices, their realities and their priorities in terms of hate crime. We've already seen this be used as a training resource in schools, particularly with young people, but it can be used in so many different settings for just understanding, like I say, where we're at in terms of hate crime, what matters to people, really deconstructing what that conversation is in an accessible way, and understanding why this needs to be a priority. So I would also urge listeners to have a look at that film. It's definitely one that I can't watch without crying, but I think that alludes to how important it is and the conversations are.
And what is it that you're doing at the moment that people might be able to get involved in or contribute to? Is there anything going on that people are interested in finding out more?
Yeah, so I think we've got some really exciting stuff going on at the centre at the moment. I don't know if exciting is absolutely the right word there, but we've got a couple of different live projects that we're working on. The first of which is our Rural Racism Project, which we've seen get quite a lot of national media attention. I'd say how supportive that is has been quite wide-ranging, which is quite interesting in itself. But this is a research project where we're currently doing field work, where our researchers up and down England working with different minority groups out in the rurality. So what are people's experiences out in rural England? What does diversity look like out there? How do we celebrate kind of different communities? What does history mean? What do landmarks mean to people? So for any kind of minoritised groups or diverse groups that engage in countryside, our rural racism team are phenomenal, and we'd be really keen to have those kind of conversations. In terms of what's coming up for us at the centre, I've mentioned it's our 10-year birthday, so I would say stay tuned for the exciting things we have there. We're doing some quite exciting strategy level work, so like I say, reflecting on where we are after 10 years and thinking about the fact it's an election year. What should we be demanding? What do we need that's a bit different? So we've got some strategy bits coming up. And we're also going to be starting a new massive research project. Quite daunting how massive it is, but looking at hate crime in higher education. So we're partnering with the regulators of higher education across England and Wales to look at what our diverse students' experiences in higher education at the moment. What does having an identity mean in higher education, and how can we make sure that people are safe? These are inclusive spaces. And again, I mean that completely beyond the monitored strands. So this is going to be the biggest piece of hate crime research, looking at how different identities might interplay in higher education. So again, that's another really massive piece of research that hopefully will be quite exciting when thinking about shaping education moving forward.
It sounds really, really interesting, and
Yeah.
look forward to finding out more about that ourselves.
Thank you.
That sounds great. So, well, thank you. So I could sit and talk to you for much, much longer. You seem to be doing loads of stuff. There's exciting things coming up. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you for having
You've
me.
certainly, the centre's certainly influenced the work that Communities Inc. has done. It informed our training. And yeah, we look forward to continuing to build a relationship with you and see how we can help and support you in the future.
Completely, and that's completely mutual. I think, particularly in the climate we're in, working together, sharing good practice, thinking about what barriers are. That's what makes us stronger moving forward. So thank you for having us, and we look forward to working together.
Right, thank you.